last week, we talked about Socrates. All right, let's see here. All right. And as you'll recall, we characterized Socrates as something of a skeptic, right? Today we're talking about Descartes, and so the way I wanted to start was just by contrasting two different kinds of skepticism as they're represented by these two major figures, right? So on the one hand, we have Socratic skepticism. We could call it Socratic ignorance. We talked about how Socratic ignorance is motivated by a pursuit of wisdom. At least Socrates claims this, right? Socrates claims that his ignorance, his professed ignorance, is actually a manifestation of intellectual virtue. He says he's just being intellectually humble and honest. He's saying what other people refuse to say. They pretend to have knowledge. They think they know, whereas he says all that he knows is that he doesn't know, right? So that's the motivation for Socratic ignorance, the first kind of skepticism. And the main tool that Socrates used throughout, we discussed this a fair amount, was the elenchus, right? This dialectical technique of asking questions. Most of the time in the dialogues that Socrates is appearing in, these are questions he's asking to other people. He's going to politicians, to artists, to scientists, people who claim to know things about the world, and he's asking a series of questions in an attempt to get at the truth, or at least to show them that they don't know about whatever particular thing he's asking them about. And of course, you can also use the elenchus not just in conversation, but in reflective thought, right? So you might ask a series of questions to yourself, like either as you're writing up some sort of philosophical treatise, or just as you're sitting there in your room thinking. You can think, why would I think this particular proposition is true? Okay, that's why I think that. Well, why would I think that's true, right? Asking a series of questions in an attempt to get at the truth, right? Which Socrates thinks is going to produce this kind of Socratic ignorance. Okay, so that's one kind of skepticism. And the kind we're going to be focusing on today is what we can call Cartesian skepticism. Called Cartesian skepticism because we're attributing it to Descartes. And the motivation for Cartesian skepticism is very, very different. It shares some things in common, I suppose, but it's sort of, Descartes is working in a vastly different time period, much later than Socrates. And his skepticism is a response to some pretty specific things that were going on in that time period, right? So the way I captured it here on this slide, I said the motivation for Cartesian skepticism is to find a rational foundation for scientific knowledge. Now I put scientific in parentheses there because really Descartes is interested in finding a foundation for all knowledge, a certain foundation for all knowledge. And science for Descartes and scientific are somewhat technical terms, but whereas we tend to think of science as an academic discipline or as a profession that's totally separate from everyday life in some sense, back in Descartes' time, science was seen as totally continuous in terms of knowledge, right? So all the knowledge that we have aspires to be scientific knowledge for Descartes, right? That's what sort of paradigm he was working under. So he wants to find rational foundations for scientific knowledge. Basically, this means he thinks that we need some certain foundation for everything that we believe. And how does he do it? What tool does he use? He uses what we call the method of doubt. We're going to be talking about that a bit more today. But first, I want to ask what we mean, or what Descartes means when he talks about rational foundations. Okay, so take a look at this slide. It illustrates one way in which beliefs can be structured, right? Or in which a set of beliefs can be structured. So if you look at the very top belief, we have the claim or the proposition, the butler committed the crime. Okay, so this is a thing that, maybe a detective, maybe Sherlock Holmes believes the butler committed the crime. And then you can ask, well, why do you think the butler committed the crime, right? And hopefully, whoever made this assertion is going to be able to back it up with some other beliefs that they have. They're going to say, well, you know, he had motivation. I saw him near the scene. And in fact, he confessed it. He told someone that he did. Okay, but notice for any of those beliefs, any of those claims, we can ask further questions about why those are believed. So take the middle belief here, right? So the butler committed the crime. Why do you believe that? Well, I saw him near the scene. Then I can ask, well, why do you believe you saw him near the scene? This isn't very natural. We don't do this a lot in everyday life, but of course we could, right? There are a bunch of suppositions or assumptions that we can kind of draw out. You might say, well, it appeared as though he was near the garden and the crime was committed near the garden, right? So I think that the crime scene was at the garden and it appeared as though he was there. So I saw him at the scene and he thus committed the crime, right? So you can move back upward to the original belief in question. But again, notice, and this is where Descartes gets almost infuriating, notice that you can ask further why questions about even these beliefs, right? You can ask, well, why do you believe the crime was committed near the garden? You can say, well, look, the victim was found near the garden. There was blood near the garden. You can ask, well, you know, why do you think that that's true? And you can continue to go all the way back to what Descartes would want to say are the rational foundations of your beliefs, right? So here's the way in which beliefs are supposed to be structured. They're based on or grounded in other beliefs, beliefs that we might call more basic or more foundational. These are sort of like architectonic metaphors for the structure of belief or believing. And Descartes' project is trying to get to the very bottom level, to see if at the very bottom level, we have complete certainty, right? And one more thing I'll mention about this as we're sort of still on this slide is if you look at the beliefs that are like closer to the ground, so to speak, you're going to notice those are things we tend to be more certain about. Whereas the beliefs that are further up the chain tend to be things that we're less certain about, right? So I'm very certain that my vision is reliable. I'm almost 100% certain. Of course, my vision's reliable. Not always reliable, but like generally reliable, right? I'm a little less certain that things are generally as they appear. I don't know, I guess, you know, that my vision is reliable can help explain why that's the case. But then for particular instances where I think I've seen something, I think a little bit more doubt creeps in, right? So if you're looking at the structure, not only are the more foundational or more basic beliefs closer to the ground level, they're supposed to be things that we're more certain about. Okay, we'll further explain that in just a second. But first, we've used this phrase a couple of times. We've used this word, justification. Descartes uses it, and definitely epistemologists today use it. And so I just want to give you a brief definition of it. Here's the definition that we're going to be working with. Justification, you might call it epistemic justification, is the property well-evidenced beliefs have that transforms mere beliefs, mere true beliefs, into knowledge. Okay, so here's the word in a sentence. Her belief that vaccines don't cause autism is justified. She's done extensive research. So what we're saying is the belief is well evidenced. It turns a mere true belief or an opinion that she has into knowledge, and thus her belief is justified. Okay, so that's how we're going to be using justification or epistemic justification. Sometimes you'll hear people call it warrant, or they'll add the word rational to it. They'll talk about rational justification instead of epistemic justification. These are all properties that are either the same or they're in the same neighborhood. For our purposes, we can just say they all refer to this one property, epistemic justification. Okay. Good. So, stop sharing here for a second. Okay, so Descartes' main project in the Meditations is to look for maximally secure foundations for all of knowledge, right? We often do this in a particular domain or with regard to a particular question. So you might sometimes ask yourself, you might think, I believe X, but I don't know why I believe X. Or I don't know if it's really true. I believe it. I've always believed it, but why is it true? And you can call into question the assumptions on which that belief is based in order to find more justification or rationalization for it. Okay, so we do that sometimes with respect to particular beliefs. Descartes wants to undertake this project totally generally, right? With respect to all of knowledge. And so what he uses is what we can call the method of doubt. We'll define the method of doubt here like we defined the elenchus. So we'll define this as subjecting one's more foundational beliefs to doubt in order to provide one's total set of beliefs with more justification. So again, think about all the beliefs that you have. You believe that the sky is blue. You believe that Notre Dame is located in Indiana. You believe that you have two hands. All of these sorts of things. That's your total set of beliefs. Descartes thinks if you can subject the more foundational beliefs to doubt, you're going to provide that total set of beliefs with more justification. And so in the Meditations, that's exactly what he tries to do. Stop sharing this. Make sure everybody's got a chance to copy that down if you're taking notes. Okay. Like I mentioned a second ago, though, so Descartes does this in the Meditations. He does it really formally, and he does it very generally with respect to all of knowledge. But this is something we also do, right? So again, we'll return to this example throughout the semester. But imagine that you have these friends, and you imagine that the friends start behaving sort of strangely towards you. You might ask yourself, look, all these people are acting like my friends, but how do I know that they're my friends, right? And by subjecting that belief to doubt, you can uncover the grounds of the belief. You can say, well, I believe that they're my friends. Why? Well, because they act generally nice towards me. They're kind of kind to me. Because I'm a nice person, and like, who wouldn't want to be friends with a nice person, that sort of thing. And by grounding those beliefs in more certain foundations, you can justify or rationalize the higher level beliefs. So this is something that Descartes does in the Meditations, but it's also something we do in everyday life. And how we do it is we identify a belief that we want to justify. We find out what it's based on or what it's grounded in. We try to doubt those beliefs, the beliefs that it's based on or grounded in, and then we investigate those beliefs in order to eradicate that doubt with certainty so that the original belief is now justified. Why is it employed? Well, by Descartes, it's employed to give science a rational foundation, and by us, it's employed to improve our rationality, to justify our belief set, or to become more intellectually virtuous. So here is sort of the takeaway from today's lecture. Descartes is a philosophical skeptic. He argues that scientific knowledge needs certain rational foundations, and he uses the method of doubt to go about doing that. I'll mention in passing that the position Descartes ultimately arrives at is called foundationalism, and it's influential in epistemology even today. But it's not universally accepted. So if you go to an epistemology conference, not everyone there is going to be a foundationalist. We're going to look at Augustine next class period. And I'll reference some others as we go. But there are some philosophers who have argued that foundations, either because they're not rationally attainable or because they're just unnecessary in general, aren't actually needed to ground our belief set or to provide any sort of foundation for knowledge. So foundationalism, while it's been very influential, isn't universally accepted.